All right, let's go ahead and get started. Well, welcome and good afternoon or good morning or good evening, everybody, depending on where you are. And welcome to the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention here at Binghamton University in the State University of New York, USA. We're delighted to have you here for our January edition of our webinar series. And for this edition, we're delighted to have the first of a two-part series about the prospects for genocide and mass atrocity prevention in the incoming Biden-Harris administration. In this first part of the two-part series today, we will be focusing on the Biden-Harris administration's global atrocity prevention efforts, how those efforts can be improved and frankly repaired after 4 years of the outgoing administration, how multilateral institutions and cooperative relationships can be addressed and repaired, and what the prospects are for improving on the Obama administration's efforts and previous administrations going forward. We will be following that up on the 27th of January with the second part with additional guests that will take a domestic focus and talk about atrocity prevention as now a domestic issue here in the United States. My co-director, Nadia Rubai, will be here at the end of our session today to give you more information about that, and we'll be giving you full information, including a registration link. For today, however, I'm delighted to welcome our four distinguished guests who will be here for 2 hours with us today to talk with us about genocide and mass atrocity prevention in the Biden-Harris administration. I've neglected to mention that we are speaking to you here today from Binghamton University, which sits on land that was once occupied by the Haudenosaunee Nation. We will be here for 2 hours. I will be moderating a very open and unstructured conversation with our four panelists. Please feel free to submit your own questions to any or all of the panelists using the Q&A function, which is at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, the rightmost icon on your toolbar on Zoom. When you do ask questions, we will queue them and we will try to get to as many of the questions from the audience as we possibly can. Please indicate whether your question is directed at a particular panelist or panelists, and also please identify yourself in the Q&A. I think that is it. And so let me just briefly introduce our four panelists before we get started. And first of all, just for the four of you, it's been a very, very strange week, especially for those of you who are in Washington, D.C. We know that you guys are just as much caught up as in the political crisis that is engulfing our nation as everybody else, and that includes our overseas guests who are, I'm sure, looking on with a great deal of concern and frankly worry. So we appreciate very much your willingness to take time out of your schedules to join us here today for this conversation. I'd like to start by introducing Beth Van Schaack. Beth Van Schaack is the Leah Kaplan Visiting Professor in Human Rights at Stanford Law School, where she is also a faculty fellow at Stanford's Center for Human Rights and International Justice. Prior to returning to academia, Beth Van Schaack served as deputy to the Ambassador at Large for War Crimes Issues in the Office of Global Criminal Justice at the United States Department of State under Secretaries Clinton and Kerry. In that capacity, she helped to advise the Secretary of State and the Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights on the formulation of US policy on the prevention of and accountability for mass atrocities, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Beth Van Schaack, thank you very much for joining us today. Kate Ferguson joins us from the UK. Kate is a foreign policy expert driving a new approach to preventing identity-based violence, both in the UK and internationally. In 2014, she co-founded Protection Approaches, her non-governmental organization, where she is now executive co-director, or co-executive director, excuse me. Prevention Approaches works with communities, civil societies, and governments to transform how identity-based violence is understood and prevented. In 2017, she established and now convenes the UK Atrocity Prevention Working Group, a network of some 25 NGOs, research institutes, and experts. She's also chair of policy at the European Center for the Responsibility to Protect, an honorary research fellow at the University of East Anglia. And if you want to follow her on Twitter, she tweets at "Words Are Deeds." Welcome, Kate, and thank you very much for joining us from the UK. Lawrence Woocher is research director at the Simon-Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He has published widely on early warning, conflict prevention, and the prevention of genocide and mass atrocities. Previously, he served as Senior Atrocity Prevention Fellow at USAID, Research Director for the Political Instability Task Force, and Senior Program Officer at the USIP, the United States Institute for Peace, and a consultant to the Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on the prevention of genocide. Lawrence, thank you very much for joining us today. And finally, Jeff Sizemore is a retired naval officer with over 20 years of service. Most recently, Jeff served as the Atrocity Prevention Lead for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the State Department, overseeing atrocity prevention training for the department and coordinating efforts for the Bureau and the interagency. Jeff, welcome, very great to have all of you here. So I hardly know where to start, but we're going to start certainly on the basis of the Good Governance Blueprint paper that Beth Van Schaack has recently written. For those of you who were able, we've provided a link to that paper in your registration, but if you didn't read it, it's not a problem. There's plenty to talk about anyway. I wanted to start with that paper and with a much more, maybe more specific question. I mean, one of the things, Beth, that, and all of you panelists, that obviously is going to be one of the heavy lifts of the incoming Biden-Harris administration is to reconstruct a functioning, viable United States State Department, which has been in many ways decimated by the 4 years of the Trump administration. One of the ways that we can certainly read the tea leaves is to look at the way that the Biden-Harris transition team has thought through the nominations and appointments for senior level people, both at state but also at other related agencies that are going to go into a broad reconstruction of Americans' foreign policy stance broadly, and its prioritization of atrocity and genocide prevention in particular. So one of the things I wanted to ask you all about first, and I'd be interested in hearing from all four of you about this, is can you comment a little bit about what you make of how you assess the way that the Biden-Harris administration so far, anyway, has gone about nominating a new generation of leadership, both at state but also at adjacent institutions. And I'm obviously interested in hearing about the specific areas where there might be some evidence, I guess, that the nominees signal a robust re-engagement with America's traditional or established leadership position in the global field of atrocity prevention. I'm thinking specifically here of Linda Greenfield Thomas as the nominee for the United States ambassador to the United Nations, and this morning's announcement that Samantha Power will be taking over at USAID. USAID, of course, and State Department are very closely involved in America's global atrocity prevention efforts. And in particular, the news that directorship of USAID has now been elevated to include a position at the White House National Security Council. What do you make of these moves? Can I start with you, Beth?
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Great to be here. Thanks so much, Max and Nadia and everyone at Binghamton for convening us for this great conversation. I really look forward to a robust talk with all of my co-panelists. I think, as we say, policy is personal and personnel is policy, right? And so, who are sitting in these chairs is incredibly important. They will bring with them a set of priorities, a background, et cetera. And particularly the appointment now that we've heard this morning of Samantha Power as administrator of USAID is going to be incredibly important. And one of the themes I think we'll talk about today, and then I put in the paper and that others have articulated in much more detail, is the importance of better and more upstream prevention. And that's where we move from, DOD is sort of, in the moment when the crisis has exploded and we're trying to contain it. The State Department is often most applicable in the immediate beginning when we're starting to see warning signs, et cetera. But when we're talking about upstream prevention, that's the world of USAID. And so the fact that Samantha Power, whose book, A Problem from Hell, is really the intellectual taproot for this whole movement of atrocities prevention, the fact that she's going to be in that chair, I think is going to be incredibly important. And it will bring that development perspective back into diplomacy and then other more kinetic responses. And so we really will have, I think, a much more integrated continuum of potential ways in which we can address atrocity situation, emerging conflicts, and then full-scale conflicts. So that, I think, bodes well. Now, a lot of the same people were involved in the rollout of the Atrocities Prevention Board. And so, and I think we'll get into this again in more detail today, but there were great things that board accomplished, and there were some problems with how it was constructed, I think, architecturally. And so they have lived through that experience. And to what extent are they going to be able to live from that, to learn from that experience and implement new ideas versus returning to the old model? I think that will be something that will be interesting to see, given some of the same personnel that were involved in the APB. So I'll rest there, and I'm interested to hear what others have to say.
Thank you. Jeff, can you maybe follow up? I mean, in particular, I mean, I think that there was I had sensed the general consensus that the to-do list for American foreign policy is so long that we shouldn't get our hopes up, particularly that atrocity prevention would be super high ranking. Do you agree with that assessment? And how does Samantha Power appointment possibly change that?
I don't agree, actually. And I would say that unequivocally, the folks that I've spoken to are really heartened and excited about the possibility. And I think that existed before even the most recent appointments. But obviously, as the architect in many ways of the APB, having an individual at USA that understands the dynamics, doesn't need to be brought up to speed in many ways, actually is up to speed already, is just super, super helpful. I think for those of us that were practitioners of atrocity prevention during the most recent administration, there was some thought that sort of equity, that sort of portfolio would just kind of go away. And in fact, it did not. There was the Elie Wiesel Act passed, which actually codifies in very clear terms what the requirements are for atrocity prevention as a United States priority. That happened. And a lot of the work that I was able to do in DRL was specifically a result of the passage of that act. And that actually provides the reason that we do the training, and that I was able to build curriculum with my partners in CSO and GCJ and across sort of state to make that a requirement, that if there are foreign service officers at those posts at risk, they have to get this training. And so, was it as much as we wanted? No, of course not. But what it means is we're not starting from zero, and we have the opportunity to kind of move forward, and with individuals that have proven that they care about these equities, that proven that they understand what the problems are. And yeah, you're absolutely right. The complaints about the APB are not small in number as far as being effectual. But what you have is folks that have seen that and seen as it's transitioned into the Atrocity Early Warning Task Force, and seeing how we can do kind of some of that mainstreaming and ensure that it is not simply just stovepiped, and ensure that it's just not simply left over in a corner that you call when you want to, whereas that needs to be a part of the regular conversations. And as Beth so accurately said, it's personality driven. And so you need to have the person that's convening the deputies committee or a principals meeting, understanding that atrocity prevention is one of the factors that needs to be considered to make sure the right person's in the room. Too often I found out about meetings after they had happened, or one of my colleagues happened to get a small readout somewhere where unequivocally atrocity prevention was one of the concerns that should have been addressed. And lo and behold, oops, we found out about it after the fact. When you have folks that understand atrocity prevention, care about it, will prioritize it accordingly, it's really, really, really nice, because it means that you're involved in the conversation at the point when it's happening instead of trying to play catch up afterwards.
Thank you. That's great. I just wanted maybe a little sidebar and direct this to Lawrence Woocher. For those people in the audience who might not be familiar with the structure of American foreign policy operations, why is USAID such a significant and influential actor here, and why would the news that someone with the stature of Samantha Power be appointed to direct USAID? I mean, after all, she has been, previously the UN ambassador. Why is that a significant indicator of the Biden-Harris's priorities?
Yeah, well, first, thanks, Max, and to the Institute for convening. I think over history, USAID has kind of bounced around in its stature and significance and its independence from the State Department, at times being brought more into the fold and having more direct reporting lines to the Secretary of State and being seen as, in a certain way, an arm of the State Department, and at other times has been more independent. But the practical reality is that USAID has a significant capacity to provide foreign assistance of varying kinds, ranging from the upstream prevention kinds of activities that Beth referred to, that is supporting social cohesion programming or conflict mitigation programming or good governance programming in dozens of countries around the world, where there are USAID field officers working as part of country teams in those embassies or USAID missions, and engaging with local partners, which is, I think, a very important aspect of USAID's operations. Oftentimes, USAID field officers have a really good sense of what's happening in countries where they're working, and sometimes those are different channels that might be coming through State Department political officers and embassies. And so I think there's also been a kind of debate about whether USAID's operations ought to be strictly about apolitical development activities, eradicating poverty and the like, or seen as contributing to US national security interests and priorities. I think that over the years, the consensus is that it can do both, and it doesn't have to be a choice. But to the latest news, I think it is a significant boon for USAID to have somebody of Samantha Power's stature at its lead, and really does signal that USAID will be part of all foreign policy conversations at the highest level, and that USAID's particular voice will be heard there. I just maybe would add one or two other thoughts on the appointments more generally. To the earlier question, I do agree with Beth and Jeff that they're encouraging for people who are committed to atrocity prevention. I would say I think they're less telling than maybe in some recent past transitions, where we've known less about what the senior leaders actually think about what U.S. foreign policy should be like. None of the appointments really that we've seen so far have been surprising. They reflect first veterans of the Obama-Biden administration, but they reflect people who share President-elect Biden's general orientation to the U.S. role in the world, to engaging with allies, to working multilaterally, to human rights being part of what matters for U.S. foreign policy. If you think about 4 years ago or 12 years ago, where we had relative newcomers to the political scene and didn't really know what their foreign policies were going to be like, we were watching much more closely what these appointments were like and what they would tell us about the future policies.
Thank you very much. And I wanted to turn now to Kate Ferguson to get your perspective from across the pond. I mean, obviously, this is going to be a tremendously fast pivot for American foreign policy to move from a highly transactional America first kind of policy to an attempt to broadly re-engage and to repair and shore up a whole range of transatlantic relationships, especially with, for example, the UK and the European Union. One of the things that we hear a lot about in that is the problem of lost credibility. That the United States has lost not only its leadership role in global atrocity prevention, but has lost credibility in making a claim to replace that. So from your perspective, I mean, you in your work are very used to working with and engaging with state partners. How would you rate the expressive function, if I can put it that way, of these new appointments in terms of an attempt to repair, or at least to begin to address, the enormous loss of credibility that the United States has experienced in the last 4 years?
Yeah, thanks so much. That's such a question that me and colleagues have been hashing out over the last kind of days and weeks, and today's news of the appointment of Samantha Power has sent us into a flurry of conversations. On Samantha Power particularly, a couple of things. She actually appeared on our Foreign Affairs Select Committee last year as part of an inquiry into the future of UK foreign policy, where she was very explicit about the fact that if the UK retracted on its commitments on international development, that would be seen as a downgrading of UK power and influence in the world. I mean, a position that I agree with wholeheartedly. And in the light of the merger of our Department for International Development, which is our equivalent to USAID, with our Foreign Office, I think that sent a signal to the world and to allies like the US that the UK didn't take its commitments in international development as seriously as it used to. Now, whether that is how it manifests, I hope sincerely it won't, but it has already ushered in a reduction of our commitment in spending. And so I'm mindful when you talk about the need for the US perhaps to be thinking about rehabilitating itself and rebuilding its relationships, that the UK also has played some role in damaging those values and those norms and that rules-based system and that burden sharing that was something that, 4 years ago, perhaps we took for granted. There's some other points though about particularly the appointment of Samantha Power to USAID, because I think it signals a real opportunity, as Beth says, to kind of think about that integration of the lessons of atrocity prevention over the last 10, 15 years. And atrocity prevention now looks and feels and is implemented very, very differently to how it was first conceived when the Atrocities Prevention Board was first announced, or back even further when the responsibility to protect was first sort of established in 2005. And so thinking about this opportunity to really ground US atrocity prevention within development contributions, upstream, integrated, I find hugely exciting, because there's a way of reorienting the agenda and maybe challenging some of those real and also perceived grievances about what the atrocity prevention agenda is about, rooting it in prevention first, not reaction and response. And this is the conversation we're really trying to have here in the UK. And so, my bias is that for me, this is a very useful appointment, because I think it signals to the UK that this is a serious matter. And then maybe the last thing I'll say on this question, although I'm sure we will get into it more this evening. Well, it's this evening for me, it's afternoon for you. You started this section wondering whether the new appointment signaled a return to a traditional role. And I wonder, and maybe a question to put to my other panelists, is it actually a moment to reimagine actually what US leadership is in the world, particularly at this moment of flux and change, not just domestically for the US, but we are living amid a global pandemic. There has been a period of democratic backsliding in countries that have traditionally or historically been champions of human rights and atrocity prevention. And so is there actually a way for the new administration to do things maybe slightly differently? And perhaps, Samantha Power heading up USAID could signal that. But from this side of the pond, we're not as certain of these things. And so if you're reading tea leaves, then we're sort of reading some weaker tea or something. I don't know what the analogy would be.
Well, thank you, Kate. I think that Kate has posed a question directly to the other three panelists. I'm happy to have them respond in any order you'd like.
Maybe I'll just weigh in quickly. I think the point about restoring US credibility is really important. And we can't just walk back into rooms and sort of assume that we can exercise leadership again, right? We have had 4 years of, as you mentioned, Max, in your introduction, in which diplomacy, multilateralism have all been not just abandoned, but under attack in many respects. And so I think we're going to have to, as a nation, approach our multilateral engagements really from a perspective of humility to a certain degree, learning from what happened in our own system, particularly when we have, in the heart of our very democracy, we have mass violence happening, concerns about insurrection. And I know people in DC are quite concerned about what's happening in the next week or so. I mean, we are in a trigger event, right? If you think about the classic lexicon of atrocities prevention, we have a whole set of risk factors and we have a huge trigger event happening. And so, what used to be something that happened out there is now something that we have to consider happening potentially here. And so we have lessons of our own to learn, and to approach this with humility and to be welcomed back into the international community is important. That said, we know that there is a need for American leadership here, and our allies across the pond and in Europe and elsewhere are really desperate to have another strong voice in the General Assembly, in the Security Council, in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and in other multilateral bodies. And so I think the Biden-Harris administration is really well poised to do that, particularly with this very experienced diplomatic corps that are being put in these top places that can envision what a humble yet still strong and confident U.S. foreign policy can look like, and how we can start to rebuild the whole global international rule of law order.
Thank you. Jeff?
I would just say, I think that point about humility is crucial, Beth, and an understanding like that it's not just humility when walking into the room, it's humility when sort of talking to folks on the ground, when working with partners locally. One of the things that we kind of had a big conversation with, specifically in democracy, human rights, and labor, is about ensuring always that you have the local understanding and that you're not simply making decisions from that 30,000 foot view, that you're working as hard as you can to be as understanding, as clear, as curious as you possibly can be. And so I think there's a real hypocrisy if we don't understand that we are not, we've proven over the last couple weeks, months, et cetera, that many of the same risks that we're looking for. Your point about this being a flashpoint is exactly one. You look at any kind of risk list, we are literally like doing a check mark as we sort of march down. There's very, very clear risk, 7-8 blocks from where I'm sitting right now. And so having that humility, having that sort of perspective is absolutely crucial. And I think the point about USAID that Lawrence made about them being very much sort of driven towards that upstream, I think collectively, if you talk to the sort of the practitioners inside, the understanding is upstream is always the preferred option, because the mitigation options, the response options are actually less. And so trying to do as much as you can to sort of push that to the left of the timeline is huge. And the idea of, where does USAID fall in its relationship sort of collectively? If you talk to the individuals at USAID and the individuals at state and the individuals at DoD at certainly the working level, there is an understanding that those efforts need to be complementary, and that you need to have deconfliction, and that we benefit, and that if a program is not specifically labeled atrocity prevention, that doesn't mean it's not doing atrocity prevention work, because you get a lot of sort of those side benefits as you improve the role of women, as you improve involvement in government, as you restore belief in democratic norms. Like, all of those sort of have positive, even if only tangential, improvements as such. And so the idea being, let's make sure that those conversations are happening, and that is being driven forward is absolutely important.
Thank you. Lawrence?
I couldn't agree more with Jeff's last point there. I think as to the question of, is this kind of an opportunity for charting a new articulation of the U.S. role in the world and what U.S. leadership means? To my mind, it's not only an opportunity, but it's a necessity. I think that the world has changed. This is not just what has happened in our own country over the last several years, or the particular political crisis we're experiencing right now, though those are certainly extremely important. But there are these broader long-term global trends that are affecting the way US policymakers need to think about effective strategies for whatever particular foreign policy goal they are, and certainly including preventing atrocities. So just, I mean, to illustrate, you know, the UN Security Council has long been kind of the main forum for sorting out atrocity crises and trying to forge multilateral responses. I think the Obama years increasingly demonstrated that that is not a viable option for many of the most important cases. And that's certainly continued to be the case in the last few years. I think as we look at the changing distribution of global power, we should not expect that even a different orientation to multilateralism will change the fundamentals, which point towards serious conflict and disagreement on most situations of consequence at the UN Security Council. So we need to think hard about what do we do if that's not a forum where we can work out good solutions or good responses to these kinds of problems. And it's not to say that people have not been thinking about this, but that's one of many, I think, significant trends that will be even more pronounced in the coming years than have been in the past.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we have a few questions queued up and I'd like to get to them shortly, but I want to do a slightly deeper dive into this particular conversation right here, because I think it's touching on something, to my mind anyway, that's really quite fundamental, maybe even on a conceptual as well as on a practical level about atrocity prevention. I mean, a few moments ago, Kate Ferguson said that, look, the global landscape of atrocity prevention, it has changed over the last 10 years. And it's changed, first of all, because of changes in global politics, but it's also changed because of a certain kind of a learning curve amongst the broad spectrum of atrocity prevention actors, whether in as state actors or civil society actors. And I think that really the four of you guests here have been part of that movement, which is really a very powerful growing consensus that will strongly prefer upstream or structural prevention to a midstream or atrocity intervention. It's cheaper, it's more effective, it's more politically acceptable, and on and on. This was already built in, I think, to the idea of the pillar structure of the responsibility to protect, in the idea of the first two pillars being ultimately about building capacity, building resilience, addressing and systematically identifying, addressing systematically structural risk factors and structural sources of fragility. Here's the question I wanted to see if I could ask you to explore with me, and it really goes back to the way that Lawrence Woocher, in your response to Beth Van Schaack's original paper, expressed a certain number of worries about the Biden-Harris agenda. Let me see if I can put it as concisely as I can. I don't do concise very well, but bear with me. Let's say we all now know that upstream is the place we should be working, if we possibly can. We also know, as Beth has written, as Lawrence has reminded us, and as Jeff and Kate have now confirmed, that when we do shift, if that's the right word, resources, attention, policy, and programs toward structural upstream kinds of prevention activities, we will become more and more engaged with, or I think the word that Beth would say would be adjacent to, other kinds of policy priorities for international development, for support of local, regional, and local non-governmental organizations and civil societies, for addressing good governance issues, corruption, access to essential medicines, healthcare, clean food and water, conflict resolution and peace building. So the question I have for you guys, I guess, is one of these on the one hand, on the other hand things, right? And I think that I'm being inspired by Lawrence, a point that you made, so I'm going to start with you. On the one hand, the more we move upstream, the better, in some fundamental sense. On the other hand, as we do so, there is, if not the risk, then the inevitability that the specificity, the concreteness of atrocity prevention as a goal that is distinct from all these other adjacent goals, worthy though they are, becomes, if not lost, then diluted, not diluted, diluted. Do you see this as if I've explained this well, do you see this as a problem for not just American policy, but for the global response to rising atrocity prevention threats? Or do you see this as a welcome or as at least a non-damaging idea that atrocity prevention loses its specificity the more that it goes upstream? And I wanted to start with you, Lawrence, because I think that this is something that you specifically have been thinking about lately.
Yeah, thanks, Max. I guess I'd say that if done well, that embracing this broader integration of atrocity prevention with what Beth referred to as adjacent imperatives, it can be actually a positive thing and be very effective. But it's important to articulate what that means about doing it well, because I think sometimes we've probably all seen efforts at so-called mainstreaming, where an important thematic issue just gets its own paragraph in the report, but basically people just use it as a way to say, well, we're already doing that. And so that's not what I'm talking about. But I think you've articulated it well, that when you're dealing with situations where there may be discernible risks of significant large-scale violence against civilians, but those dynamics are not yet escalated to actually ongoing attacks, it is much more difficult to distinguish exactly what the most useful actions, what goals those will contribute to. And in the likelihood is they will contribute to multiple goals. To my mind, that spells good strategy, not confusion. I think the part that I would emphasize, though, we need to bear in mind is, while embracing this integration, we can't lose that preventing mass atrocities is a distinct and important goal. So that those situations where there actually is tension between different goals, where that will happen at times, there is an open and honest debate about those tensions, and those situations where there are more specific distinctions around atrocity prevention versus other goals, that the investment goes into those activities as well. So I think that comes to what I articulated in the piece I wrote, the need for a clear and convincing articulation of the US commitment to preventing mass atrocities and genocide. And that this has got to be more than just a line in the national security strategy, which is basically always there for the last 20 years. And even more than, one good speech. This needs to be kind of repeated and articulated and demonstrated through action, so that the sort of action officer level person in the State Department or in the embassy, as well as in other governments, really understands how this fits within the overall prioritization of US foreign policy.
Thank you. I'd love to hear the other panelists' views on this. Kate?
I mean, I can maybe come in with a kind of counter point of that, because even though, I agree with so much of what Lawrence just said, that the experience in the UK is almost on the flip side of that, or it's in fact actually maybe an iteration of the very thing, Lawrence, that you're warning against, where if atrocity prevention just becomes a line that is included in documents and therefore it is assumed to be present, but actually because there are no explicit or directed capabilities, resources, structures, or strategies to support that implementation, we actually therefore have a situation in the UK where atrocity prevention, such as it is conceived in the UK, is either wholly subsumed within conflict prevention, which we probably most of us on this call don't really need to go into why that is a problem, or it slips through the gaps between conflict prevention and development. And I think that in the UK, we can see a danger of what happens when you assume that simply naming an agenda within various documents is sufficient. And as I was thinking about this call that we had today, I wondered if in the case of the atrocities that took place in 2017 in Rakhine, we have a kind of case study of the two different approaches of the US and the UK, both of which we can agree could have done a lot better. And I wondered about kind of thinking about that just for a moment, because in the UK's context, it was the emphasis on conflict prevention and a pro-democracy conviction, a conviction that pursuing democracy above all else was the right thing to do in Myanmar. And also, of course, really prioritizing the hopes of what Aung San Suu Kyi claimed to represent. But it was in the absence of any kind of atrocity prevention thinking or strategy, either at embassy level or in our central government in the UK, that meant actually the UK was really ill prepared. And so while many in our atrocity prevention world will call the collective muted response to those red flags in Rakhine that were kind of leading up very, very clearly, not just in the months and years, but sort of decades beforehand, of the risks that were being posed to the Rohingya. They've said, oh, it wasn't a failure of early warning. We knew it was coming. It was a failure of early action. But in the UK government's case, I really do think it was a failure of early action because it lacked any kind of atrocity prevention thinking. And so none of the people in embassy had received that kind of training on what the dynamics of mass atrocities look like, how they're different to the dynamics of conflict, how actually the dangers of kind of transitional context can really inflame and pose those risks. And also the warning systems that the UK use for assessing overseas risks of conflict and instability don't integrate those common indicators and risks that are distinct to mass atrocity crimes and different to those warning signs of armed conflict. And so in the UK sense, they simply weren't catching those warning signs. The team hadn't been trained in recognizing them, and there was no internal mechanism for sending that information up. And so it was actually an example of sort of, if you are assuming that you're doing atrocity prevention because it is included in your language, but you don't have any specific strategy, it's not anybody's job, you haven't focused on it, it's a real danger. But when I was thinking about that, I also then was reflecting on the US response to Rakhine. And I don't think there are any international embassies in Rakhine or in Yangon, sorry, that come out well from this situation. And I actually wondered if perhaps in the US's case, and this is a question, not an analysis, was the US's understanding of atrocity prevention in fact too narrow in that case, and not sufficiently integrated into the understanding of what else was going on there? It maybe didn't fit the bill. Now, I'm not quite sure why that happened, but it's my understanding. And of course, forgive me, I'm in London, and this comes from conversations when I was in DC or with your colleagues and your counterparts. So if I've got this wrong, I'm sorry, but it was my understanding the Atrocities Prevention Board didn't, in fact, do a very good job at prioritizing that crisis. So I don't know if that helps, Max, kind of as a potential case study of, on the one hand, you have a state that assumed that it was integrating atrocity prevention in such a broad sense so as not to do it at all. And on the other, you had the US that certainly had the most well-developed and specific and targeted atrocity prevention strategy. And what we can kind of learn practically, not just for the US, certainly for the UK as well. Although I should say, I do think that steps that the UK in Myanmar have taken since are really fantastic. And they have learned considerably from those harsh lessons. So that is a positive.
Yeah. So let me turn to the panelists. I mean, did the fact that the United States have a dedicated atrocity prevention board, or what later became a dedicated atrocity prevention early warning task force, underfunded or unfunded as it was, sidelined as it was, non-transparent as it was, do you think that the fact that we did at least have some named all of government mechanism made us fail better in terms of Myanmar than, for example, the UK did? I mean, if you're going to, yeah, I'll leave it at that, and then we'll turn to some audience questions.
So I literally got to the atrocity prevention job pretty much as this is happening. And so for me, the perspective I have is as it went. And, you know, my understanding is purely from a mitigation point, because at that point it was already known and it already occurred. And so I don't have the run up to be able to say as those sort of decisions were made and as that sort of happened. And so sadly, I just can't speak to that too terribly intelligently. What I would say is, you know, our response after the fact, we have regularly come up against what actually are the options available and what actually can one do. And when confronted with ongoing atrocities, what is in the quiver available for you to be able to use? And the options are not as nearly as numerous or as helpful as one would want, which is part of the reason why driving towards the prevention aspect, you have so many more options available, whereas as the ongoing atrocities are happening, it gets really, really limited as far as what is actually going to be even a viable option. And so, you know, we at State and we in DRL did a lot of work as far as documentation to sort of make sure, okay, so that these have happened. How do we have this information? How can this information fuel transitional justice so that you can work towards answering what happened and not have retribution and not have recurrence? And so obviously that's something that's, but I would say that it's not like the threat in Rakhine is not still present. It's not like there isn't still answers. And so some of the questions as far as what did we know when, what could we have done when, how was our response? I think we're not even clear of the situation yet. And so some of that learning and some of that asking of the hard questions is still going to happen after the fact. I mean, we certainly are asking questions about responses to various atrocity situations 15, 20 years after the fact. That is still occurring. I did want to sort of talk about the point about making sure that we're not necessarily lumping everything together. And I think the Global Fragility Strategy and then the Global Fragility Act is a really good sort of way of thinking about that, because as that process happened after Elie Wiesel, and there has been this movement to define how the United States is going to respond to fragility globally and how that is in the interest of the United States, we that were the specific atrocity prevention purveyors and practitioners really worked hard to make sure that atrocity prevention wasn't simply subsumed and became just a footnote in the GFA and a footnote in the GFS. Because yes, many of the activities are mutually supportive. Many of the activities work well together, but there is unequivocally specific, distinct, clear stuff that is just atrocity prevention, and making sure that that's not lost and not ignored is important. And I would say kind of going forward, anytime you're looking at conflict prevention or fragility work, making sure that the atrocity sort of stuff. And the point about ensuring that senior folks are giving support, that's super important for those action officers. You need to have the talking points. You need to have the public statements. You need to have sort of that oomph behind you so that when you're walking into a meeting or you're walking into a conversation or you're trying to push something forward, you have that support. And so having individuals that A, understand, B, are supportive, and C, are vocal about that is absolutely crucial. You know, not that the response was perfect, not that the options available over the last few years have, but honestly, just simply having the Elie Wiesel Act as a piece of paper that could hold up that says, the reason why I'm at this meeting, the reason why this is occurring, the reason why these dollars are being spent, the reason why we're doing this training, and specifically one of the main points of the training that we push out is that reporting, so that as you have more and more individuals that are looking for the signs, looking for the actual risk factors, and then reporting that up early, that's exactly what you need. Is you need that backstop, that foundation from very senior individuals, so that at the working level you have that option available.
Thank you. Yes, does anyone want to follow up on that?
I was just going to add on the Myanmar Burma question, and Jeff, you were definitely there at the when the thing was in full conflagration. I will say that the APB had Burma Myanmar on their radar very early on, and one of the key initiatives that was pursued, which is hard to do, as someone said, we're not omnipotent here, right? Was to try and encourage Myanmar to create a nationality law that was inclusive and that brought everyone in, because that was one of the core problems with the Rohingya. They had that inherent vulnerability because they were not recognized as true citizens. And so if that could have been accomplished, that would have done, I think, wonders in terms of making it so much harder to alienate that entire ethno-religious minority. But I think where the fatal flaw happened, honestly, was the assumption that Aung San Suu Kyi would fix everything, right? And she came in, she had a position of power, et cetera. But if you know her history, if you know the history of her father, you know well that there is a Burmese nationalism, right? And the Rohingya had aligned themselves with the colonial power. No offense, Kate, but they thought, in fact, it quite puts the Brits in quite good light in a way, right? They felt that it was the safest course of action, that the British would look out for them at the time of independence, and memories are long. And so that, when push came to shove, she was not going to sacrifice her political power to protect a group that has been reviled in that country since before the independence period. And that's, I think, what we missed, that we sort of lost sight of the ball. And then 2016, things ramped up and then exploded in 2017, when it was, as Jeff said so eloquently, it was sort of too late to do much at that point. The other factor, and this gets back to this point about, who is sitting in chairs really matters. Mitch McConnell has a very personal relationship with Aung San Suu Kyi, and as a result, he's blocked many measures of any consequence that might have come out of Congress in terms of sanctions, et cetera. And so that's another barrier, I think, for the United States having a more robust response. But, as Jeff said, once it comes to that full conflagration, there's very little that can be done other than mitigation, humanitarian assistance, et cetera. We can think about tinkering at the edges. We can use sanctions. We can give immigration benefits. We can do documentation, as DRL has been so great about funding around the world. But there's little that we can do in the actual moment.
Okay, great. Thank you. Lawrence?
Just maybe add a quick word on this. It's not from my personal experience, but from the public reporting I've read on the case and the internal deliberations and debates. The main fault line was between, I think this was about 2016, was between people who were arguing for quicker relieving of the sanctions against the government and those who felt that we needed to retain those as additional signaling, especially to the military, and demand further progress, especially on the Rohingya treatment. I think one thing that is enlightening about, if that's a faithful description of what the internal debates were, is that I don't think anybody would actually claim that even had the sanctions been retained, that would have actually had a halfway decent chance of preventing what happened in 2017. And so to me, I think that's should reinforce to us, this is more than who cares more about preventing atrocities. This has to be about hard-nosed thinking about effective strategies and how we can use the full range of tools and influence, and recognize when the US alone is not going to be able to influence the actors in the ways we like, and what we do then working with others. So I think that it raises questions around strategy as much as it does around priority and bureaucracy.
Thank you.
Okay. Do you mind if I just come in on the end of that? I think that there's something really important here from what Lawrence has just said, but also Beth, in kind of this error that so many made in believing in Aung San Suu Kyi, and seems to be something that routinely happens in failures to confront and prevent and recognize the risks of modern mass atrocities, where people in positions of leadership are perceived to be believable and trustworthy or not capable. And I think in the early months poor Syria has been in this conflagration for a decade now, but in those early months, in the early period, there was a sense that Assad was someone who could be done business with, and who was the right person in power, and that he was a moderate. Infamously, perceptions of Milosevic, really played into certainly how European, and I'm afraid especially British, political leaders charged with trying to bring peace in that region, they had him and the architects of Atrocity around the table. And so how can we kind of learn from the fact that you need to have the right processes in place? So in a sense, it's not a matter of personality always. I mean, I do take this point that personality is so important about who's sitting in chairs. But when we're looking at where those risks of atrocity are, sometimes it doesn't necessarily, it becomes less important who is in the chair, because the risks have risen to such an extent or are so recognizable. And too frequently, I think you see, and I understand the desire to keep those diplomatic channels open at all costs, but there's got to be something around our strategy and engaging with leaders and being able to at least employ that kind of scenario planning and foresight around situations that aren't totally hinging on the person in charge doing the right thing.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to start getting to some of our audience questions. We have 17 of them queued up now. And I don't think that we'll be able to get to all of them, but I'm going to try to at first cherry pick so that we can move the conversation right where it was going. So Wes Rist from the American Society of International Law asks, in the US, is there a need to continue to build legislative tools on atrocity prevention, even though the Biden administration is likely to prioritize atrocity prevention issues? Or would having competing claims over atrocity prevention in the legislative and executive branches actually hamper real efforts at prevention? It's a fascinating question, because one of the things that Beth Van Schaack that you really described well in your paper is how busy Congress actually has been during the Trump administration in terms of atrocity prevention legislation. And so there's been actually a great deal of interesting activity. If you look at not just Wiesel, but the two Syria acts, the Women, Peace and Security, obviously the Global Fragility Act that Jeff Sizemore just asked, the expansions of the Global Magnitsky Act to try to sanction human rights violators and atrocity perpetrators financially. So, is it a Goldilocks question? I mean, is the more legislation the better, or eventually does more legislative effort start working at cross purposes to itself?
I guess I would just answer quickly, and indeed, you're right. I mean, Congress has really grasped the mantle here, and this has become a truly bipartisan issue, and that's, I think, very exciting. We have so few of them, so here we have one finally, so let's do what we can with it. We have, as you said, a whole, and as my paper sort of just quickly lists, a whole suite of new, interesting atrocities prevention and response legislation. What I would say is, importantly, that money has to flow with this legislation. It's not enough simply to create a whole bunch of obligations and lots of flowery language around the findings of Congress and the importance of this, et cetera. We need to have actual funds that we can, A, build the capacity in-house, and B, push out to effective implementing partners who are in the field at a very local level. There's another great question about how do we work with local movements here, and the key is to capacitate them, right? To give them the tools and the resources that they need in order to build out their staff, to build out their programs, to reach more people. They're going to have the credible voices in these societies, not some foreign expert coming in, parachuting in and giving a talk and then leaving. And so, as long as Congress, on the one hand, I think it's really important to hold the executive's feet to the fire. And I think that's what Elie Wiesel does as a sort of omnibus piece of legislation, but it has to come with funding. And Congress has started to do that. And so now the Office of Global Criminal Justice, for example, has funds in order to push accountability exercises, documentation, et cetera. DRL, the work that Jeff has been doing, has been fantastic about, capacitating and giving funds to this. And then now, of course, USAID as well, working farther upstream. So, obviously, I think we can get to a point where there's such a patchwork that there's confusion, as we have now in Geneva, for example, with some of the treaty obligations under human rights treaties, and there might be a need to kind of streamline. But, at the moment, I'm still happy to have more from Congress, particularly because I think it creates a set of commitments upon not just Congress as a corporate entity, but individual members of Congress who care about these things. If they're exposed to the reality of what's happening into the world and the types of vulnerabilities that are out there, and the role that good U.S. programming, policy, et cetera, can do, I think they'll be more bought into this. And that was one of the criticisms of the Atrocities Prevention Board that I highlighted in my paper, and that it didn't develop an independent relationship with Congress. And so as a result, it was sort of an unfunded mandate that really depended upon the power and influence of particular individuals in government driving the portfolio forward, rather than having the money there and saying, what good can we do with this money? What is the best use of this? How can we build out our tools and also capacitate good efforts that are happening out there in the field?
Thank you.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't be more excited, because ultimately it's, if all you're doing is saying that there's a requirement, but there are not the people to execute it, and your major addition to the work is to require a report, but there's not actually anything substantive that's going to be feeding that report, then it's not terribly helpful. If there is legislation that A, dictates this is a priority, B, ensures that there are sufficient personnel to execute that mission, and then resources them accordingly, so that both from a personnel standpoint inside of government and from the work, be it programming, be it training, be it assistance, whatever that may be, that's the means by which Congress absolutely can drive the train towards a better outcome. If all it is an increasing number of reasons where folks have to go up to the Hill and brief without actually having the time to go do that work or having sufficient personnel, that becomes problematic. I believe definitely that it's useful to have the support, and it's crucial actually, but it should be substantive and not simply words only.
How about, thank you. Let's just focus for a moment just on let's zero in on one little bit of this picture, which is the reporting requirements from the executive to the legislature. I mean, the Trump administration has done this in terms of both the Wiesel Act and the Global Fragility Act in, I think, what Beth and Schaack, you call a pretty perfunctory way. It's been very short on details. Just taking as our example the Global Fragility Act, and I guess the strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability, which was just released by the State Department, I suppose, on the 20th of December, so a relatively new document. Once again, it is critics have said that this is once again not really what the Global Fragility Act was asking the administration to do. It was asking for an actual detailed step-by-step plan of what countries it was going to invest what resources in over what period of time. As we transfer now from the Trump to the Biden administration, do you think that strategy is going to be useful, or do you think that it was really just a sort of a ticking a box and getting an administrative task out of the way? Is that going to be a useful document for the, I'm trying to ask a question that was suggested by Jack Meyerhofer at AIPG. Is that going to be a useful, meaningful document for the Biden administration, or is that going to go into the recycling bin?
Just, I mean, a quick reply. I think the timing, as you point out, is very strange.
It's very strange.
Is a significant piece of legislation intended to really change the way the U.S. does business in supporting fragile states, and so for the strategy to come out, in this inter period with the new administration coming, does raise some questions. From what I understand, the incoming team has been briefed and they've had some discussions about it. So I think there's probably some utility to the discussions, interagency discussions that led to that strategy. Whether the strategy as a document is especially useful is a different question. But I think you're right that there's still some unfinished business there, in that the executive branch does need to identify priority countries and regions for the fragility strategy. So that will presumably come from the incoming administration. And I think one of the innovative things in the Global Fragility Act is the provisions for sort of not just reporting, as we've seen with the strategy, but kind of ongoing back and forth between the executive branch and Congress on the effectiveness of the strategy as it's implemented, and adjustments that are made to the strategy in specific places as time goes on. So I think those are things to watch. It seems to me it's an important foundation, but I doubt anybody's going to grab it off the shelf to guide what they're going to do in any particular place.
Well, speaking of on that topic, I mean, if we could turn now from domestic American legislation and the relationship between these two branches. Once again, I'd like to have a more international focus. And Beth, you've said many times, and it couldn't be truer. You have to sort of follow the money. I mean, it's a matter of how, as you put it, these kinds of initiatives and legislations and actors are capacitated, which I assume means given money to spend or given a budget. And so here's given the global landscape, I mean, this is again a time for a reality check, which doesn't necessarily imply cynicism, but actually is a request for information. So here's a question from Jens Peterson, who's senior advisor on peace issues at the United Nations Association of Sweden. Mr. Peterson writes, over the last 15 years in my home country, Sweden, with 9 million inhabitants, has donated $200 million to the UN Peacebuilding Fund, which has a role in atrocity prevention. Meanwhile, the United States on the same period has donated 550,000. The Secretary General Guterres has asked for a quantum leap toward more resources for the fund. What hopes, and I assume that this is not a rhetorical question, but actually an actual substantive question. What hopes could we have that Ambassador Power shows that the US is willing to take its part, at least in that quantum leap? So hard-headed question, do you find it plausible that the United States is going to actually begin to fund at a proportional level some of these multilateral, if not UN-based, then otherwhere, these multilateral atrocity prevention programs? Lawrence, can I start with you?
Sure. I mean, I think my starting point is that the Congress over many, many years prefers bilateral funding to multilateral funding schemes. Mm-hmm. And that's not just for things related to atrocity prevention, but that's for basically everything. And so I think I would have kind of modest expectations here of what progress you might see. I do believe that in the omnibus appropriations bill that passed just before the end of last year, there was some provision in relation to the Global Fragility Act about a multi-donor pooled fund, a new pooled fund for fragile states. But I think the reality is that appropriators in the U.S. Congress almost always will prefer to appropriate dollars through U.S. government agencies to places that we care about, rather than donating them to multilateral efforts like the UN Peacebuilding Fund.
Okay. A follow-up from the rest of our panelists?
I think. Sorry, go ahead, Kate.
No, you go first, because mine's going to be tangential, I suspect.
Okay, well, actually, mine might be a nice segue to you. So let's see. I was just going to say, I think Lawrence is exactly right, that there's a real skepticism around the United Nations. And we've seen this over the years in terms of the fights we've had with UN funding and pulling out of various international organizations in an effort to sort of strong arm reforms and this and that. So, we need to think about funding happening at multiple levels, the multilateral level. And then in the civil society space, you have sort of organizations that are sort of mezzanine organizations. And I think of Kate's as a great example of this, that are coordinating other civil society organizations out there, coming up with best practices, bringing people together from different communities that are facing shared problems so they can brainstorm about what worked in their system versus other systems, and then truly grassroots and local. And so that is where I think I can imagine someone like an Ambassador Power is going to be. Obviously, she's worked at the UN, and so that will be a priority for her. That's not her pocket, though, right? That's not her wallet. So she's going to have to convince her colleagues to have other wallets. And Jeff can probably speak more about this because he's worked more on the funding side than I have. But really working at this mezzanine and then the truly local level, that is where I think we will see a much greater investment from the United States. And I really hope that that's the case. We've always had a very small percentage of our GDP going to development work. And there's interesting polls of asking Americans, and you'll say, what percentage of US foreign policy money goes to development? They'll say, oh, 30%. They have these very inflated numbers when it's a very tiny percentage. And so there's a lot of room for upside. I'm always trying to find a positive spin on things. There's lots of room for upside. And I'm sure that Samantha Power and others who are in these positions, Linda Thomas Greenfield, whom you mentioned, are, they care about multilateralism. And so, I think we'll see it at different levels.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was a perfect segue, Beth. I mean, actually, I think you put more articulately some of what I was going to try and say, because I think that there's a separate issue of the real need to kind of rebuild multilateral resources, and that's far bigger than atrocity prevention. You know, that there's a lot of work to be done, and it's far bigger than simply the US, and has always been the case. But obviously, we all hope that there will be a re-entry and a recommitment in all of those areas. But in terms of thinking about sort of what money works in atrocity prevention, I mean, I think Beth has really set out half of what I was going to say, and sort of thinking about these creative funding opportunities or kind of forums that really have the biggest impact. But rather than repeating what Beth has just said, I think there is a separate piece there, which is actually really about a kind of urgent need to invest in prevention policy more broadly. You know, like, what does prevention foreign policy look like? And not just in atrocity prevention and preventing identity-based violence, but preventing climate change, preventing pandemics. You know, it actually requires, I think, a real radical shift in thinking about how foreign policy or internationally facing resources are made. And it's not reacting to the crises that we can see, because we know that doesn't work. And I think Pathways for Peace some years ago now made some real headway in terms of how we can kind of think about preventing violence, but it's broader than that. And it's about thinking about sort of preventing those crises that we can't yet see, but we know that we can work to try and mitigate. And I think that some leadership, both in thinking and also probably, you know, dipping into the wallets from the US in thinking about how to fund that kind of prevention policy in international thinking and in the multilateral and global space would be very, very welcome. I also do think that there are some very interesting shifts in that thinking, certainly happening in the UK and in other European states. I think Germany has done some very interesting thinking about reorienting some of its priorities in its international policy around this idea of preventing and prevention, not just atrocities and violence, but more broadly.
I mean, Zach Kaufman, who's with us today, his work, I'm sure you all know, he has a question, I think, that's on that. And he asks, first part, what do you foresee as the future overlap between atrocity prevention and responses to climate change? How, if at all, do you anticipate the Biden-Harris administration will or should approach this intersection differently than past administrations? I think that's a really important question. The Biden-Harris administration has gone back into the, we could call them the usual suspects, and for high-level appointments to deal with climate change, that's for sure. We can take that one of two ways. I mean, one way to take it is this is a very high-level appointment. On the other hand, it's not necessarily an appointment that brings actual, let's say, renown in climate change expertise to the table. So let me just put it that way. I mean, how would you respond to Zach Kaufman's question?
I mean, you can't do the work and ignore the effects of climate change. There's just too many country contexts that I can think of off the top of my head where that is a clear driver and is going to get worse, not better. And you have fairly clear agreement, regardless of politics, that is specifically kind of driving that now. And so you have to sort of think about it. And you also have to think about the pandemic and what the pandemic is going to do as far as the work. There are very, very few country contexts that I think of that were at risk that are better as a result of the pandemic. Like they have gotten worse. It is going to be a long time, and money absolutely has a part to play in that. You are going to have governments that are stretched thin that are going to have to make real clear choices as far as how to do expenditure, how to do appropriations, and figuring out where to prioritize. And that's going to mean for the US also, like the questions as far as what the incoming administration is going to be able to spend. There are going to be some really hard debates as far as how that's going to go, because there are going to be financial implications as a result of the pandemic. And so to ignore what climate change is going to do for atrocity prevention, to ignore what climate change will do for future pandemics, which will most likely increase in frequency as you have more consolidation of individuals in urban areas, and you have fewer and fewer resources to sort of respond to that. I don't see a world where you can't, where those aren't lashed together, because to do so would absolutely make your work invalid.
Thank you. Other responses?
Maybe just to say, I think that there is a real opportunity at this moment, not just because there is a new administration, but we have all collectively lived through this appalling pandemic. And while it has certainly been absolutely no equalizer, there has been something really remarkable about a shared experience. And you know, I'm sure everyone on this panel will have had the same experience of speaking to colleagues all over the world and having this kind of sense of solidarity and shared experience, whether I'm speaking to, you know, you guys in the US, colleagues in Nairobi, and we are living through something together, even if it is not equally felt. And we know that the risks of identity-based violence, of mass atrocity, are not particular to some communities in some parts of the world. They exist to some extent everywhere in all societies, but just to different extent. And climate change is also the same. It is not an equalizer at all. Those most vulnerable are hit the hardest, but it is also something that we all are impacted by. And I feel like there is this moment that is brought by the pandemic that enables a kind of a shift in how we approach global challenges that also begins at home, not in a way that deprioritizes our international obligations, but in a way that actually perhaps redresses some of the imbalances of how these policies have been thought about in the past, where they've been kind of siloed or assumed to be needed in more parts of the world, rather than closer to home, and then they can be perceived by others as being inconsistent. And so the UK can be held to be accused of sort of promoting certain policies in other parts of the world and not upholding them at home. And I think similar accusations are sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly leveled at the US. And so I do think that there is a kind of, maybe it's around establishing a narrative or around communications, but it's also around consistency. And maybe going back to, you know, the first point, or the first question that Max asked right at the beginning of, do these new appointments that the Biden-Harris administration are announcing signal a return to some sort of classic leadership, or actually, as we seem to be saying on this panel, a new kind of global leadership? And so I recognize that that's quite a sort of high altitude answer, but I really think that in this kind of period of building back better, there is some really exciting opportunities, or at least as a kind of, the activist in me sees some really creative and important opportunities to buy in domestic populations to these global agendas that we haven't really found answers to in the past.
I just add one thought on the linkage to climate change. It's not about the government's role, but really a thought for the grassroots activists out there. Think if you compare today's moment to 10 or 20 years ago, many of the people who back then would have been activists against mass atrocities and genocide are now focused more on things like climate change. So I think that it's actually for the civil society groups and activists out there who are focused on atrocity prevention, finding ways to build bridges with the groups that are focused on climate change would be an important project. There is a basis there in the realities, and you also think if there is ultimately any kind of multilateral approach to dealing with climate change, it will almost certainly include large infusions of funding from the richer countries to the countries that are hardest hit by climate change. It's at least important that those funds be spent in ways that are sensitive to conflict dynamics and human rights issues and potential atrocities. At most, maybe there's a way to use those in ways that are kind of more focused on preventing the kinds of conflicts and atrocity crises we're talking about.
I'd like to, we have plenty of time left, but I'd like to see if I can't ask you to start exploring I mean, a difficult topic that's sort of been the elephant in the room. Jeff has already brought it up, which is the current political crisis in the United States. I mean, as I mentioned before at the beginning of this webinar, we will have an entire session, part 2 of this actual webinar will address the domestic atrocity prevention agenda in the United States. And we will be having that event on the 27th of this month, and we'll be having information on how you can go ahead and register for that. But a number of our audience have asked some very pointed questions. And I'm going to try to bundle them together, if you don't mind. One of the things that both Kate and Jeff have mentioned, and Beth Van Schaack talked about this in her paper, is that, I mean, to paraphrase Kate, America's role in atrocity prevention shouldn't attempt to return to the old normal. There has to be a new normal. Part of that has been that if you look at the whole sweep of American policy, including up to and including the formation of the Atrocity Prevention Board, it's always been externally directed, right? It's always been bringing American soft power, occasional kinetic power, expertise and resources to try to predict and prevent atrocities overseas. The United States has been distinctive, I think, in this lack of a domestic component to its overall atrocity prevention mechanisms. That the incorporation of a domestic component is long overdue. The events of the last week, as Jeff has been talking about, have certainly sharpened in the minds of a lot of people that we are ticking a lot of boxes for heightened risk of atrocities. But of course, this would come as no news to African, to Black Americans, to Indigenous Americans, to undocumented refugees at the US southern border, and to other groups. I would add, by the way, that in terms of the response to the pandemic, right, I think for a lot of Americans, especially my child's, my grown children's generation, this is the first time for comfortable, safe Americans that we've experienced government incapacity as lethal rather than as annoying. And so given that, I have a couple of questions that I want to sort of bundle together from our audience and just have you guys respond to them any way that you want. I mean, the first one is from people someone who, well, both of them are people that you surely know. I mean, here's Shukriya Delawar from the Friends Committee on National Legislation, and she writes, many colleagues engaged with advancing atrocity prevention work have been sounding alarms over risks of atrocities in the US for months. And now last week's events highlighted why we press for prevention. I'd like to know, she writes, if panelists have any ideas on how to engage atrocity prevention experts that have been assessing risk in foreign countries to apply the knowledge at home. Also, and this a couple of questions I've gotten about this, would the Atrocity Early Warning Task Force be open to such a discussion? And maybe I can even sharpen that question a little bit from our dear friend, Ambassador Liberata Mula, who's with us, who writes, the ambassador writes, I have attended twice the Conflict Prevention and Stabilization Forum sponsored by the State Department at the State's Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. At each of these forums, my question, which I also put to the panelists, to you guys, is why the US Atrocities Prevention Policy and the Act of 2018 is largely externally focused, more externally focused than domestically. As we all know, foreign policy is an extension of domestic policy, and the shocking violent acts of January 6th underlines this fact. It has to start at home for US global atrocities prevention efforts to have any credibility. So I don't want to step on, I don't want to start moving into the area of our part 2, but while I have you guys here, because I hope you'll be in the audience for our next one, but you won't be the panelists. Can I hear your views about this whole tangled and I think very, very disturbing set of issues? And
maybe
we start with you, Beth. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks. I don't mean to grab the mic again, but
Not at all.
it is something I've been thinking about actually throughout the Trump administration. The question of transitional justice and what those tools and ethos and principles might have to say about our own national history, not just the last 4 years, but going back to slavery even. I mean, we know there are renewed calls now to revisit that early history and what impact that has had on current race relations, radical inequalities between people of color and white citizens of the United States, and even things like the Tulsa massacre happening, on a very local level, not necessarily a national agenda of transitional justice, but thinking about discrete sub-national municipal Georgetown's decision to give tuition free attendance to the descendants, et cetera. I mean, we have resisted over the years applying those tools to ourselves. And if you recall, in the immediate aftermath of the Bush administration, there was talk about having a truth commission to address how the United States responded to the attacks of 9/11 and why we went off the rails when it came to our detention policies, et cetera, surveillance, and all of that. And there was a very strong resistance from many members of Congress in particular who said, we're not South Africa, right? That's not us. Well, it is us in some respect, right? And so those tools, when it comes to things like truth-telling, memorialization, guarantees of non-repetition, reparation, apology, and even accountability, they exist for a reason. Ultimately they are preventative because they expose the reality of what happened, the causes and consequences of a particular course of action, how it impacted actual real human beings. It encourages the government to take responsibility for that, even if it was a previous government, previous administration, to take the responsibility and to find ways to redress, and then to put in place consequences so that it makes it less easy to repeat those mistakes. We know that it's hard to prove deterrence, just like as the earlier question sort of implicated, it's really hard to prove that prevention works because we can't live in a parallel world where we withhold a particular intervention and then compare the results and do good social science research. But I think instinctually we understand that if something bad happens, you cannot simply brush it under the rug, draw a thick line and move forward. It will come back to haunt us in a way that some of these historical moments and then the Trump administration will come back to haunt us. So I do think there's a time, and I think Nadia's panel the next session is really inspired in this regard, and to sort of think about what can we learn from other transitional states that have transitioned out of a period of repression, violence, authoritarianism, autocracy into a renewed democratic commitment. What can we learn from those societies? And might we think about implementing some of those measures here in the United States, dealing with the border, racial injustice, the events of last week?
Thank you.
I would say that some of our partners, some of our colleagues, some of our closest allies are starting to do some of this work internally. There's some work in Canada right now to address some of the historic wrongs. I know there's some Australian work looking at that. Our history of not addressing the issues with Native indigenous populations in the United States and the history of slavery and Black and African Americans is absolutely problematic and definitely needs to be addressed. I will say, I know that Peace Direct and a few of the other sort of colleagues that we work with regularly are starting to turn their focus more domestically and putting resources toward research, putting resources towards that, because it has to be addressed or you end up with what we've had for the past week and a half. Like, it's very, very simple cause and effect. As far as why the Atrocity Early Warning Task Force might not do that work, it's because there are actual just functional, the State Department does not look internally. The State Department does not work domestically. USA does not work internally. USA does not work domestically. And so there are some limitations on just who the makeup is of those organizations in their ability to look domestically. I think you would find pretty consistently the individuals that are actually doing this work and are part of those will recognize the problems inherent in our domestic policy, will recognize the divide, and can very quickly give you the list of the risk factors as they are present. But from a functional standpoint, as far as the actual ability to do that work and do that effect, there are limitations based on sort of the way that the government. And so you need to find other means to address that. Yes, Matt?
So a quick, thank you. So a quick, I really want to hear from Lawrence on this question, but just a quick follow-up on that very point. And again, I'm trying to touch on a couple of questions that are in our queue, including one that was asked by Teresa Forbes. And also one that was asked, excuse me, for one moment by Garrett Kurtz, who's on the German Council of Foreign Relations. Now, it has to do, I mean, Jeff, you make an extremely good point, which is this all of government approach that was first conceived of with the Atrocity Prevention Board and which is preserved more or less in the task force is the all of government in government is nearly all federal agencies in the executive branch that are looking outward, right? DOD, in the intelligence community, the Treasury, state, USAID, and on and on and on. So in other words, not the entire, I'm exaggerating, but in a very powerful sense, the whole all of government approach of the United States signal atrocity prevention mechanism. It's a telescope that can't be turned around. And one of the things that if we start thinking we're not going to just go back to the old APB, we're probably not going to, if we're going to re-energize and revise the task force, what kind of agencies, what kind of actors should be included in an all of government approach so that that lens, to use Alex Bellamy's word, doesn't just point outward? Who should be at the table, who's not? How about, Lawrence, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I'm not very sanguine that a governmental entity of any kind is going to meet this need. I think we need to turn to civil society actors of various kinds.
Yes.
I think part of this is because some of the same reasons that cause the risks are reasons that make it almost impossible to think of a workable governmental initiative here. I mean, that is to say, the extreme polarization, the extreme differences of opinion about how to interpret our history and what would be appropriate responses make it hard to even think of what kind of initial inquiry or kind of discussion structure would be appropriate. That doesn't mean it wouldn't be desirable, but it strikes me as probably is very unlikely. So I think we need to turn to these more community-based actors, and many of us who have been involved in different kinds of groups may also have been thinking more outward, and maybe it's a bit of our work ourselves in our outside of our immediate professional lives to look inwards as well. I do think I think it was Shakriya's point that I have seen several helpful reports from people who've been analyzing the risks in the United States, whether it's under the frame of atrocity prevention or violence prevention and peace building. A few come to mind immediately. The Crisis Group put out a great report a couple months ago. Rachel Kleinfeld at the Carnegie Endowment's done some excellent writing. Heather Hurlburt and Rachel Brown from New America, and there are others, but I think, so I don't think there's necessarily an absence of the sort of sharp analysts turning their attention here.
Max, you won't be surprised that I want to.
It was me.
I want to come in on this.
It's a public service I do for you. To be
I know. I mean,
who breaks the ice and forgets to unmute myself. Let me ask the other panelists to sound off on that, and we have a question from Jane Van Alstyne, which is on point here.
Matt.
Yeah.
Mind if I come in on?
Not at all. Not at all.
Because I think, like, for those of you that know protection approaches work, like, this is why we were founded, was to kind of bring some harmony in between domestic approaches to, we prefer the framework of identity-based violence rather than mass atrocities, because we do this work at home and we begin in our own communities, and we learn from the work that is done abroad, as well as working to enhance UK contributions to the kind of global challenge of atrocity prevention. And I think first, in response to Lawrence's point of sort of how would you go about responding to the last few years in the UK, in the US, surely we draw on our expertise as atrocity prevention thinkers, practitioners, experts. And you're right, you go to the communities that are most hurt, where those divisions are most raw, and they are the experts on what is needed. But that has to be supported, as we always know and would say if it was in any other context, right up to the very top. You need leadership, you need resource, and you need a narrative. And I think that thinking about how those exercises that are going to be needed really at the grassroots level and among communities, as well as in that leadership space, and how and what role atrocity prevention expertise in civil society and in State Department and elsewhere can play, I think is really important. And beyond US borders, the role and signal it would send to the atrocities prevention community and beyond writ large in the world of the US to be looking inwards, to be acknowledging, I think the leadership there cannot be overstated. And I recognize that I might have a bias because, in 2014, when PA set up, and I tried to talk to people in the UK and the US, that we tried to set up an organization that would bring those practices domestically, we were really met with some kind dismissal and some less kind dismissal. Unfortunately, Brexit in the UK, the rise of the far right across Europe, the experience that the US has been living through has shown and exposed what was always true, that these risks are always present in our societies. And I think it's worth really highlighting that it's not just the US that has gone through this difficult period. Perhaps it has in a more extraordinary and a more visible way. But if we think about those other models that exist in kind of white global North countries that consider themselves to be champions of atrocity prevention, let's maybe reflect on the EU task force, the European task force on the prevention of mass atrocities that I think was published maybe 2013. Those risk factors that they listed, all externally facing, these were all about where there would be countries of risks and situations of risk beyond Europe's borders, included things like group-based inequality, where high levels of human rights violations are being committed against a group, when there's a rise in radical ideologies about groups, when there's economic insecurity and inequality, when there's low trust in the press and in the governmental institutions. And I think that this is a problem that is beyond America, but the US has a real role and I think opportunity with the new administration to take some lead there. And maybe circling back to a point that Beth made earlier about funding and kind of looking at those creative spaces. One of the things that, and again, this is my bias, it's something I've been fascinated by, bringing the expertise from the global atrocity prevention community to the UK, to our divided communities in London, is something that we really find very, very valuable. And what a message it would send if the US was sort of importing expertise of atrocity prevention rather than perhaps what is sometimes unfairly seen to be a kind of exporting of knowledge. I really think it's such an exciting opportunity. So sorry, Max, I had to come in and say.
No, that's absolutely fine. And I think that vision of reversing the flow of expertise and this is a measure of the situation, reversing the flow of expertise, reaching out to our partners in the Great Lakes region of Africa, reaching out to our partners in Southeast Asia or in Central and South America, and asking them to give us their best practices and lessons learned about things like countering hate speech or building resilience in communities or addressing identity-based violence. Seems so obvious, and yet on another level, it's I think so foreign to the way that Americans have become accustomed to think about how atrocity prevention works that it really sometimes seems like an alternative universe, and it's certainly a better one. On that note, I would love to have you guys, first Jeffrey, Jeff, go ahead, and then I wanted to get to a question from
Yeah, I was just going to say that, I had a really fortunate experience to spend some time with a bunch of interagency colleagues in Auschwitz a couple years ago. And it was from across the interagency and not just the externally focused. Dealt with a lot of colleagues from the FBI and their hate crimes office, and that there are folks in government looking at this internally and trying to combat this, and that they care, that they are informed, that they absolutely believe the work has value, and that there is actually work that needs doing. And so I would agree with Lawrence that as the only response does not seem plausible or viable, but I do think that those efforts can be stoked, and that there can be work done to enhance those efforts, and that there can be a mandate to address that internally, and that it has to be both external and internal to government, and to ensure that there is actually the movement forward. And so I know those colleagues are out there doing the work, and I can't fathom how busy they are right now and how difficult it is, but I truly believe that there is a place for that, and that we need to collectively support that where possible.
Thank you. Lawrence and Beth, do you want to join in? I have actually, just on that point, here's a question right on this topic of, I'd like to name names and ask you to name names in terms of some potential partnerships in civil society organizations where governments would find promising partnerships, promising resources. So Jane Van Alstyne writes, the panelists have spoken about governments that have had major shortcomings in atrocity prevention. I was wondering what organizations or NGOs or governments the panelists think have been the most successful at atrocity prevention, or expect to be the leaders in atrocity prevention in the near future. We often talk about, scanning the horizon for impending threats, rightly so. We don't often scan the horizon for impending or emerging prevention actors. So I would love to hear, as part of our conversation about the future of atrocity prevention in the Biden administration, if you were scanning the horizon and you had set your sights not so much on mid-level or medium-level risks, but on emerging prevention actors, whether civil society or states or you name it, who comes to mind? Lawrence?
Yeah, two thoughts on this. One, we did a series of reports recently on the role of civilian communities and civil society actors in preventing mass atrocities. And one of the themes that came out of that work was that a lot of this work is happening under the radar at the local level with by actors who are not using atrocity prevention language to label what they're doing. And they're probably the least likely entities to receive support from Western donors like the US government, because they don't have the system set up to apply for US grants and that sort of thing. But in many cases, these are extremely influential actors, and they're not just NGOs as we think of them. Sometimes they're just influential community actors and or business leaders and the like. So I think we need to, in a way, expand our conception of who is a preventive actor in this context. And I think there are things that we can do, even acknowledging the gaps between US government processes and these sort of hyper-local actors, to improve the capacity that they have to do their work. The other thing that came to mind by this question is just thinking back to 2001, when the Canadian government sponsored the International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty, which produced ultimately the report on the responsibility to protect, which of course, through lots of iterations, was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2005. This, I think, is a great example of a kind of mid-power government using a small amount of money and its convening power to bring together a bunch of independent former leaders and to do some hard thinking on a hard topic, and that actually proved to be an extremely good investment. So I think there are probably those kinds of opportunities to look for as well.
I'll just add, I don't do funding normally. I've been on the policy side of things, and so I'm not as familiar with how this all works, but I think Lawrence's point, and I really would commend those reports Reva Kantowitz and others have done. They're just fantastic in terms of the role of civil society and the idea of the peace builder. You know, who are the peace builders in a local society and then in larger concentric circles in a national society, and figuring out how to enable them to have their voice be magnified. And again, this is where, you know, we can do this as a funder. We can say, okay, let the Beltway bandits apply for the money, right? Because they, as Lawrence says, they have the systems in place, they're reliable, they know they have good M&E staff, they're big enough that they can put together all the paperwork and all the reporting requirements, but encourage them or force them, to use more coercive language, to have a consortium where they're directly identifying who the local actors are that they're going to work with. And so that we bring them into the conversation. So you don't have the Beltway bandits having to sort of, you know, figure out who the right players are, but have that be part of the application process. I think that's great. And I also recommend the Auschwitz Institute that Jeff mentioned. That's really, many policymakers have gone through that program. It's transformative.
It is. We have done it here ourselves. Both co-directors have, and it's been transformative is the word that I would use. Yeah.
Hey, Max, if I could just follow up on Beth's comment. One of the things I have found most that I'm proud of about working in DRL is that we have the ability to fund without necessarily telling the world that we're funding it. And that we have a stipulation where there is not the requirement that the money has to be specifically shown as US money. The USAID has a massive budget and they do incredible work, but there is the requirement that the boxes have the flag printed on them and that it is shown as US assistance. DRL and a few others doing similar kind of work have a stipulation that because it is unsafe for the actual implementers, because it is unsafe for those folks on the ground necessarily to be tied, that we have the ability to do some of that funding. And that's, in my mind, often some of the best work that we are able to do. And your point, Beth, about ensuring that you have the large folks that understand how to get through the funding processes. The number one question that shows up on any panel as we're figuring out what programs we're going to support is who are their local partners, and ensuring that those local partners exist and that they are ones that we know actually are tied in. Because if that's not the case, then it absolutely becomes if you're big enough to figure out how to get through the bureaucracy in order to get the money, then it means you're pretty well disconnected with actually what's going on. And so continuing to kind of drive that and make sure that that is the focus is certainly something that from a programming standpoint that we're looking at. You know, the Consortium for Transitional Justice, that's something that we support regularly because we're seeing benefits and that you're able to hit a lot of organizations that need those resources at a time when it's possible to provide them.
Maybe I'll be British and not talk about the money, but do talk about the core point of who are emerging prevention actors. Not because I disagree with anything that's been said. I really think I share that view, but I really wanted to underline community organizers, whether domestically in the US or anywhere in the world where, you know, that preventative resilience building work is needing, or the closer that you get to the point of violence. And I think that this is something that has certainly, from the UK watching the US, we have at least seen more visibly the real power, energy, organizing capacity, creativity, and power of community organizing in the US over the last, certainly in the last year, but throughout the last period. But I also think there is a space emerging for those who are really good at bridging different arenas. Those actors that are good at bridging the community and scaling change. Because any of us who have worked in and with communities know that the core to the success of that work is the specifics. You need to be trusted. You need to have the trust of your allies, the trust of those who are your obstacles. And it takes a really long time to develop and build that specific honed skill set and network for the community within which you operate. And then the big question for those that are working in all sorts of community related issues, but particularly atrocity prevention, is then, well, how can you scale that? because you can't just throw money at it and then buy off the rack 400 brilliant community organizers. It doesn't work like that. And so really looking at those actors, those organizations, those activities that build that scaling capability. And sometimes it might be about training organizers. Sometimes it might be about transferring evidence to policy. It can be done in really different ways. And I think that's just a slightly different tilt on what both Jeff and Beth were saying of these consortia, these networks that bring together different actors and relationships. And then the one that no one has mentioned, and perhaps it is because we're not quite sure whether they are going to be prevention actors or not. And I think it's not because they're new, they've been around for a long time, but I think their role is in flux, is tech companies and tech organizations, not just the big names that we're familiar with, but emerging capacities of tech fora and the prevention capacities that they can hold, as well as, of course, the enabling capacities that they hold. And I have been fascinated watching the response of big tech companies like Facebook and Twitter responding to last week's event. But to me, at least, it signals a kind of sea change, actually. And I think that there will be big ramifications of that. And I'm sure there will be many, many words written about it. But that's my piece on those emerging prevention actors.
And also, just to make sure, because they won't toot their own horn, the work that the Holocaust Museum and Lawrence does is huge. The amount of research that's available is absolutely massive, and we inside of government are utterly reliant on having that available. I had the great pleasure of meeting a whole bunch of UK civil society actors through Kate and through Protection Approaches because of that organization. If you go through the participants list and you see PPWG, they are doing incredible work as far as drawing people together. The Global Center for R2P has folks on this call. The Auschwitz Institute has folks on this call. Like there are plenty of folks doing really, really, really important work, and you could do much worse than simply just going through the participants list on this and looking at the organizations and doing a bit of Googling to sort of find that, to answer Jane's question.
Thank you very much. That's us done. We are just about at the end of our period, so I have a bunch of thank yous and then a few announcements, and I will turn it over to my co-director Nadia Rubai to tell you about part 2 of the event. Obviously, thank you very much to our panelists who graciously took time out of their very busy days to come and talk to us for 2 hours and share their expertise and insights with us. Jeff Sizemore, Lawrence Woocher, Kate Ferguson, and Beth Schaack, thank you all so much for being with us today, and thank you for sharing your insights and thoughts with us. We didn't get to all the questions. For those of you who, like me, go to a lot of these Zoom things, one of the most annoying things in the world, and I'm as guilty of it as anybody, is trying but failing to get through the question list. On the other hand, what we like to do is not just have your questions go away as though they never happened. We'll record them and we will forward them to our panelists. And if our panelists would like to respond, we will give you, we'll get your contact information. We'll have them reach out to you. That's something we'll ask the panelists to do, but of course, they're very busy people, so we'll try. I do apologize to those of you whose questions were not asked. There were some really great questions here that we didn't get to, but we are taking them down, and we'll see how much follow-up that we can get. I'd now like to briefly turn things over to my colleague and co-director of the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity, Nadia Rubai, to tell you about part 2 of our event 2 weeks from today.
Thanks, Max, and thanks to Jeff, Beth, Kate, Lawrence. That was a terrific discussion. I learned a lot, and I really appreciate you all sharing your expertise. So as Max mentioned, and several of you made comments that were related to the importance of our part 2 session, will be 2 weeks from today on Wednesday, January 27th, starting at 3 p.m. So from 3 to 5 p.m. We're going to focus on the prospects for effective atrocity prevention responses domestically in the United States in a Biden-Harris administration, with particular attention on issues related to ongoing, historical and ongoing violence experienced by Black and Indigenous populations in the United States, as well as the rise of white supremacist violence. So we'll be talking about a number of the things that came up in this conversation related to humility, credibility, hypocrisy, dealing with our own past, cleaning our own house, learning from the experiences elsewhere, and perhaps bringing in experts from other places. And I hope that all of you will join that conversation. Also in February, on February 11th, which is a Thursday in the morning, we will have a webinar in collaboration with the Delier Institute for Children, Peace and Security on prioritizing children in atrocity prevention. And so we have great panelists lined up for both of those sessions already. The registration link is available for the session part 2. It will soon be available for the webinar on children. And then in March, keep your eyes open on our website and on our mailing lists. Our IGMAP Assistant Professor of Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, Carrie Wiggum, will be conducting a one-on-one conversation and interview with Alice Wairimu Indiritu, the new UN Special Advisor on Genocide Prevention. And in April, in conjunction with the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, we will be having a webinar with Indigenous representatives from various parts of the world. And I hope you can join us for all of those. So thanks to all of you who stuck it out for the full 2 hours, and especially to the panelists for sharing your expertise. Max, you're muted.
I did that one on purpose. Thank you, Nadia, for that. And as you saw in the chat, please do just drop us a line or visit us on the IGMAP website for complete information and registration links. Also, if you'd like to be added to our mailing list to keep up to date on not just the monthly webinars, but the whole range of events that we do here at the Institute. Who knows, they might be in person again someday. You never know. So with 30 seconds left to spare, I'd like to thank all of you audience members from around the world for spending part of your day with us today. I hope it was an informative and edifying session. We hope to see you again 2 weeks from today on the 27th at 3:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the second half of the conversation on domestic atrocity prevention in the United States. Thanks again. Stay safe. Have a good day, and goodbye.